Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter Pham. I'm Vice President for Research and Regional Initiatives here at the Atlantic Council, as well as Director of its Africa program. And on behalf of our Interim Chairman, General Jim Jones, as well as our President, Fred Kemp, it's a pleasure to welcome you here to the Atlantic Council and to this event that we're delighted to organize together with our good friends at the F Project, and John Prendergast will speak shortly. Appreciate your taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us, especially given developments in not just recent days, but also over the course of the last few years. The Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council was founded with a mission, with probably a triple mission. One is, of course, together with the rest of the Atlantic Council, to work on issues of importance to the interests, security of the United States and its allies around the world. But more particularly, also to work on looking a new, fresh look at Africa, the opportunities, but also the challenges integrating into the global system and the international order. And finally, of course, working to promote those opportunities for growth, as well as democratization, better governance, the same values that are common to all of us around the globe, but for which there is certainly a great call in Africa. And this event in particular brings all those things together, I think, in a very nice way, speaking about both our security and other national interests, but also the interests of Africans for better opportunities for growth, stability, security, good governance, and those partnerships that are the basis for that. About 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, in June 2014, I published a somewhat controversial op-ed in The Hill where I raised the specter, and the title was "A Third Time It's Not a Charm," raising the specter that at that point, 2 years before the constitutional end of the mandate of President Joseph Kabila, trend lines were in place and already that somehow elections which were due that year might not occur, and calling on the international community to take a firm stand to help Congo arrive at the point where the historic first peaceful democratic transition in the country's history might take place. And since then, the Atlantic Council's Africa Center has been engaged with Congolese, with Congo's friends around the globe on a variety. We've hosted members of the government, we've hosted members of the opposition, we've hosted members of civil society, and most recently, 2 weeks ago, we hosted the president of the National Independent Electoral Commission, who previewed the announcement he made last week of the electoral timetable, which would require 504 days to organize elections, placing elections potentially in 2019. Interestingly, a year before, October 13, 2016, we also hosted him here at the Atlantic Council. And at that time, he told us it would take 504 days, which would have put us into next year, but now that deadline's been pushed along a little further. A number of things have certainly happened in the year in between and continued to happen, and I don't need to rehearse all the accords, promises made, promises not implemented, and other challenges. Those are all well known. We don't need to rehearse all that, and we can get into that Q&A. But enough to summarize that this remains very much an ongoing concern for us here and for our partners, and hopefully one that this report and other work being done can help contribute to a greater awareness of these issues, but also to a solution which leads the people of Congo to what they very richly deserve, and a right to expect not only a democratic transition, but an ability to build the country, build growth opportunities, and partake of the riches of what was once called a geological scandal, and turning that into a real bonanza and a boom and a windfall for the country instead. So without further ado, let me introduce my good friend, many years, and our partner in this particular event, the founder of the Enough Project, and also the Sentry, John Prendergast. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, Peter. I appreciate very much your ongoing commitment to Congo, to all of Africa, to dialogue, to present, to create a forum for all of us to be able to discuss and debate these incredibly important issues. And I wanted to take a minute before this panel gets going and talk just a bit about the evolution of our thinking that goes into these kind of reports that the Sentry is starting to produce now, and will start to hopefully come out in a much greater frequency in the coming months and year. Congo, part of East and Central Africa, by far the deadliest war zone in the world since World War II, and it's marked, Congo, as well as many of the other states that are in this seemingly endless cycle of conflict and humanitarian crisis, marked all of them by various forms of state capture. We call it violent kleptocracy. Believe fundamentally that the root cause of the continuing violence and the reason why we haven't seen the kind of escape from post-colonial cycles of crisis in some of these countries in East and Central Africa is because of this co-optation of state institutions, repurposing the state for maximizing private gain. And in the absence of addressing that core driver of violence, in the absence of addressing that state capture, why would it change? And so our approach in part results from an assessment that the conventional tools of diplomacy, the conventional tools of crisis response, are simply inadequate for the nature of the conflicts and crises in the region that we work in East and Central Africa. The usual package that gets sort of marched out whenever there's a problem, of sending a few diplomats to support inevitably an African-led peace process, to work assiduously to send as many peacekeepers with gutted mandates as possible. Of course, the utterly essential, but often also co-opted humanitarian response, and then the sort of ad hoc judicial mechanisms that are. This is the package, and the package doesn't work. Hasn't worked, and it's proven time and again in Sudan, South Sudan, CAR, Congo, the list goes on. Why? Well, there's no consequence for mass atrocities. There's no consequence for mass corruption, which go hand in hand, by the way. The same people orchestrating atrocities, building authoritarian states, are looting these extraordinary wealthy in natural resources countries. And the United States, if you had a chart and mapped the leverage that the U.S. has in support of peace and human rights since the Cold War, it would just be one long, slow erosion of our ability to influence in positive ways the processes leading to improved human rights records and peace agreements. So you have to take a step back. If you buy that, you may not buy it. If you do, and say, well, what are the vulnerabilities? What can create consequences? What could put U.S. back at the table, rather than just figuratively, but literally, in terms of pressing and pushing forward lasting and comprehensive peace agreements that address democratic transitions and human rights? And our view is that that vulnerability is concentrated in the offshoring of billions of dollars of stolen assets by the same people who are hijacking the states and looting the natural resources of those countries. The illicit financial flows out of the country match the amounts going in for humanitarian purposes and peacekeeping purposes on an annual basis. You couldn't create a more dysfunctional international response if you tried. And the money is all laundered mostly in US dollars or euros through international banks because they are the result of criminal activity, and the money is laundered through international banks. That makes that money vulnerable to action by regulatory agencies, by law enforcement, governments around the world, particularly the United States. So to come in for a landing, how do you increase those consequences? How do you increase U.S. leverage? It's through, and it took me 30 years to figure this out as a human rights advocate, it's through the tools of financial pressure that are used when the United States is serious about a foreign policy issue. So when we're serious about getting the Iranians to the table, when we're serious about trying to influence North Korea's behavior, when we're serious about applying significant and serious pressure on Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any other terrorist group, these financial tools are used routinely. And ultimately, in our view, the most applicable tools to the Central and East African cases, in Congo in particular, are two particular ones. We've seen an evolution of sanctions. Always people have the view sanctions don't work in Africa. They sure don't, because they were poorly applied, poorly conceived, poorly applied, not implemented. And so the evolution of sanctions, of course, from comprehensive sanctions to targeted sanctions, leaves us with the usual approach in response to a conflict or a terrible human rights occurrence is to sanction one particular individual or a couple of individuals. Usually the United States doesn't have, or European Union doesn't have information about the person's assets, so it's largely a symbolic action, and thus giving sanctions a bad name. So again, when we're serious, we have the financial intelligence and we move on targets and do it in a very aggressive way for things outside of Africa. So when what the evolution, the third evolution, so you go from comprehensive sanctions to targeted sanctions, the third evolution of sanctions, in my view, this is a very sort of pop overview, because there's much more depth to this that could be discussed, is network sanctions. So to apply sanctions simply on an individual, even if you have the financial intelligence, they usually have cutouts, they usually have people working whose the money goes in their names, they have commercial collaborators inside the country and out, and when you can apply sanctions on a network of these folks with the financial intelligence to move on the assets that you're sanctioning, then you're starting to inflict pain, then you're starting to get people's attention. So that is one half of the equation of the tools of financial pressure that would matter in East and Central Africa. The other half of that is anti-money laundering measures. This is something we never use for human rights and peace, and at least in Africa. So, and it's just changing now. People are starting to understand, well, these tools from the Patriot Act and others all are available. They were used for, or originated for counterterrorism purposes. That's fine. We can apply them for the objectives that we have related to peace and human rights in Congo. So by pushing these anti-money laundering measures, we force the banks to care about this stuff, to start to look at accounts, to start to ask, well, do we want the integrity of our institutions to be penetrated by money launderers and thieves of state? That's a big question, and they don't. So they just need to be pushed a little bit by regulators. So the AML measures are key. So finally, to do all this, you need evidence. And if anyone didn't notice, the United States and our efforts to collect intelligence on the finances are completely overwhelmed by the needs to look at Russia, look at North Korea, to look at Iran, other countries in which the high priorities have been set by the executive and legislative branch. There's very little capacity left to look at African war zones for where this money's going. So we decided to set up our own entity, which we're calling the Sentry, to collect that financial intelligence on these illicit flows of money, to track and provide evidentiary dossiers to the U.S. government and other governments around the world so that they can take action, so that when they impose sanctions on particular people, they have the evidence. I'm not saying they can use that just because we gave it to them. They have to double and triple check it, but certainly that is our objective, is to be a partner in support of bringing to bear some level of consequence for those actors who would capture a state, steal the wealth of that state, and then destroy it through conflict and authoritarian governance. So the report there is, that's a little background on where this comes from. What are we trying to accomplish? And again, I really appreciate you, Peter, and Atlantic Council for giving us the chance to talk about it today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And again, really appreciate this partnership. Before introducing the great panel we have today to discuss this report, I'd like to recognize also His Excellency Francois Balouamene, the Ambassador of the Democratic Republic of Congo, honors us with his presence. And the Ambassador is accompanied by Mr. Deogracias Matumbo, the Governor of Congo's Central Bank, so welcome. Today we have a great panel to discuss this report and other issues. Immediately upon my left is J.R. Mailey, the Director of Investigations at the Century. J.R., prior to joining Enough, was a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, where he specialized in natural resources, corruption, and security. And since joining Century, he's been involved in their great work not only on the Congo, but other places, as John mentioned. Next to JR is Holly Dranginis, the Senior Policy Analyst at the Enough Project, where she focuses on the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Lord's Resistance Army, and the Central African Republic. She's an attorney. Holly's an attorney specializing in international criminal justice, sexual and gender-based violence, and natural resource trafficking, and she's worked on a number of international criminal cases, including the case against former Liberian President Charles Taylor, something that's back in the news again now that we have his former spouse running as one of the two candidates for vice president of Liberia. And finally, last but not least, delighted to have Yaya Fanusie, the Director of Analysis at the Center for Sanctions and Illicit Finance at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Yaya's prior to joining FDD institution, which I have the privilege of being associated with myself over the years, he worked for 7 years as at a certain agency across the river in economic and counterterrorism analysis at the Central Intelligence Agency. So welcome, Yaya. Delighted to have your perspective here as well. So let me turn by turning to JR to give us an overview of the report and kick off our discussion.
Thanks, Dr. Pham. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for taking interest in the report and this event. We didn't set out to find evidence of sanction busting by illicit network linked to a terrorist financier from Hezbollah. Initially, our investigation was looking into corruption in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But when we took a closer look at one particularly well-connected bank, BGFI Bank, DRC, and its activities in Congo, we found one particularly alarming set of transactions that showed that this bank had been processing transactions for companies and individuals subject to US sanctions for their links to Hezbollah. And they'd been doing so despite repeated internal warnings from employees at the bank. As our investigation shows, the same pathways, the same financial pathways that are used to move money for kleptocrats and all sorts of bad actors around the world can also be used to move money for terrorists. National security experts around the world have long warned of the dangers of ungoverned spaces, large swaths of territory that are beyond the reach of governments around the world. These ungoverned spaces can provide fertile ground for all sorts of bad actors to take root, whether they're terrorists or traffickers, organized criminal groups, armed opposition movements. But we're here today to let you know that ungoverned financial spaces can be just as pernicious. And we're talking about banks that are willing to turn a blind eye or incapable of maintaining sufficient compliance with sanctions and anti-money laundering regulations. The terror financier that we specifically focused on in this report and his network is named Qasem Tajuddin. He's a 62-year-old tycoon who was arrested in March of this year in Morocco and extradited to the United States on money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy charges. But prior to his arrest, he'd been the subject of intense and persistent efforts by U.S. law enforcement and international law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and financial investigators around the world in order to track and isolate his activities. He was placed under sanctions in the U.S. in 2009, in May 2009, for his links to Hezbollah. The U.S. Department of Treasury called him an important financial contributor to Hezbollah who provided tens of millions of dollars in financing. A few months later, in 2010, the U.S. Department of Treasury expanded sanctions on Mr. Tajuddin, including designating numerous companies that were part of his financial and business network, as well as two of his brothers, Ali and Hussein, who were also involved in Hezbollah financing activities. One brother in the Tajuddin family, Ahmed Tajuddin, was not placed under sanctions and, to our knowledge, has not ever been accused of financing terrorism. But a company linked to both Qasem and Ahmed, Congo Future, was one of the companies designated. Congo Future is the primary corporate entity we describe in this report. It's the company whose subsidiaries were engaged in transactions at BGFI Bank DRC. This is not just any small company. It's one of the primary commodities importers in Congo. According to Treasury, it's been involved in the food and diamond trade in that country, and it's been used to fund Hezbollah. The sanctions that were imposed on Qasem Tajuddin in 2009 and 2010 and his network were designed to financially isolate him. But in practice, he was actually able to continue to maintain links to the international financial system. And this is really for a couple reasons. One is because his corporate network is incredibly complicated. The U.S. Department of Justice describes that sanctions pose such a significant threat to Tajuddin's extensive business interests that he allegedly went to great lengths to evade them by hiding his identity from U.S. entities that he did business with and from government agencies responsible for enforcing sanctions. But in the case of BGFI Bank DRC, that obfuscation didn't work. The bank knew who they were dealing with, and there were numerous warnings internally that Holly will discuss in greater detail. So the second really important problem is sanctions compliance at international banks.
Great. Thanks, John. And thank you, Dr. Pham, for moderating, and to the Atlantic Council for hosting the event. I'm going to pick up right where JR left off, explain in a bit more detail exactly what we found in our investigation, and then zoom back out and talk a bit about illicit financing in the context of Congo's political crisis. So as JR said, we reviewed evidence that a bank in Congo processed transactions for these companies linked to a Hezbollah financing network. But this wasn't just any bank. BGFI Bank DRC is run by one of the brothers of President Joseph Kabila, Francis Salamani Mutwale, and has been part owned by his sister Gloria. The bank has been accused more recently of involvement in a number of financial scandals, one related to the state-owned mining company Jacamines, and another related to the Independent National Electoral Commission. The case highlighted in our report encompasses 5 transactions occurring over the course of 3 months and totaling over $1 million in US dollars. What's especially interesting about this case, JR mentioned, is that these weren't just transactions that the bank missed. The evidence we reviewed shows that there were clear warnings. Employees inside the bank raised the alarm in writing about the links between Qasem Tajuddin's financing network and the companies that were basically asking to move money inside BGFI Bank DRC. So just to take you through the story, so as JR mentioned, in December 2010, Congo Future Ovlas Trading, another company linked to Qasim Tajuddin, and then his two brothers, Ali and Hussein, were placed under sanctions by the US Department of the Treasury. By February, employees began internal communication about their concerns related to some of the customers that they suspected to be linked to some of these companies that were sanctioned. Despite those communications, in May of that same year, a Congo Future affiliate transferred hundreds of thousands in US dollars to an Ovlas affiliate through an account at BGFI Bank DRC. Later that month, another similar transaction went through. A few days later, employees raised the alarm again, now regarding these already processed transactions. They worried in writing that the situation was liable to harm the bank's image with other financial institutions. They specifically mentioned the problem of looking bad with relation to regulation compliance with particular anti-money laundering and counter-terror financing regulations that the bank was obligated to follow. But the transactions continued. Eventually, at least two banks in BGFI Bank DRC's correspondent network finally blocked at least one of the transactions. And even still, BGFI Bank DRC went so far as to appeal to OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control at Treasury, to unblock several of the transfers. That request was, according to the records we reviewed, visible to BGFI Bank CEO Francis Salamani. OFAC responded that the money was properly blocked, specifically because of links between the customer and Congo Future, the company under US sanctions for its connections to terror financing. That was all back in 2011, but we've reviewed evidence that shows that BGFI Bank DRC continues to have communication with certain individuals and entities named in the report into 2015 and 2016. Meanwhile, as JR mentioned, Qasim was apprehended in an airport in Morocco and now faces an 11-count indictment for criminal charges in the US. And meanwhile, the channels that he may have been using to move money remain unscrutinized. So why does this matter and what can be done? This is a fairly small bank. These transactions were not millions, not billions of dollars, but this is all part of a wider problem that allows for a system of organized theft and laundering that John mentioned in his opening remarks. Banks, and in fact, especially small banks, and especially dealing in small amounts, are fertile ground for money laundering, just as offshore companies, foreign gold refiners, and real estate and property can be. And that means that the opportunity for interventions are actually significant, because while the case shows that banks can be used by both corrupt kleptocrats and terror financing networks, their reliance on banks and moving money in US dollars actually means that the international community, in particular financial intelligence units, sanctions authorities, and banks have a clear opportunity to address this threat. Now, illicit financing doesn't happen in a political vacuum. As John and Dr. Pham laid out in their earlier remarks, this is an issue that should be discussed in the context of any general political crisis and political dynamics. And we at the Sentry are an organization that we are concerned with the links between kleptocracy and violence, not just illicit financing per se. There is a growing political crisis in Congo. For decades, a small subset of elites have managed to hijack the institutions that control land, therefore control resources, and therefore control wealth. President Kabila has overstayed his constitutional term limit. We can get into some of the connections and concerns in the Q&A about how this all fits into that situation. We know that sanctions last year against high-level military and intelligence officials close to or within the Kabila regime had measurable impact. Unfortunately, to date, the sanctions since that time, and particularly on financial networks, have been few and far between. Certain parts of Congo are still racked by violence, especially in Beni, in North Kivu, and in the Kasais in south central Congo. And there is evidence that it's possible that government forces are involved. The theory from some members of civil society is that the government is specifically sowing violence in order to justify a longer stay in office. We're recommending a number of very specific tools and actions on the part of international authorities. That includes higher level network sanctions against financial networks that are either undermining democracy and peace in Congo or helping to finance terror networks abroad, anti-money laundering measures, criminal investigations, and enhanced banking due diligence. And I can get into the details of any of that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holly. Turn to Yaya.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Pham, fellow panelists, John. Enough Project. It's an honor to be before everyone today. I think what I'll talk about, because I focus more in some of my work on terrorism financing, and Hezbollah has been something recently that we've really been looking at. So I'll talk a little bit about the context of Hezbollah itself and how it fits into this. In general, Hezbollah has a global network, and what it does is it leverages public corruption, bank complicity to move money around the world. So to sort of frame it, I'd actually say that it's important to think about three things, or the 3 C's, right? It's always good to have some sort of mnemonic device. 3 C's in terms of how does Hezbollah do this? Corruption, right? Meaning that officials, and this is broadly, this is with its global network, we've noticed this in South America and other places. Government officials that are aware that a sanctioned entity is operating, doing business within the country, right? So at a high level, people understand that this designated entity is working. Bank officials, complicity, right? That even separate from the government institutions, there are individuals running the bank who know that their bank is being used by these designated entities, right? And often there's a connection, in some cases, with the public officials and the banking officials. And then what does it do for Hezbollah? It provides C, the other C, cover, right? So you have corruption, you have complicity. Hezbollah has cover in order to operate. And we see that that's what it does. I mean, the other term that I like to think about is leverage. Hezbollah is very good at leveraging its global network. I mean, it has a network of business people, businessmen around the world involved in all types of businesses. It leverages, it exploits the Lebanese diaspora, which is millions of people across the world. Of course, not all supporting Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is able to leverage some individuals to do that. And this helps with money laundering, right? But there's another C, and the C is that we've touched on in terms of how do you deal with this in terms of creating a culture, creating standards and systems that would not allow this compliance, right? Compliance is the other thing, and compliance is basically from a financial services perspective is when you as a bank ensure that that you are not in any way bankrolling designated entities. And I'd also like to sort of take a step back, because you talk about finance and it seems very abstract. But really, we're talking, the laws that have been created to make it difficult for people to launder money, to finance terrorism, there's a moral imperative. It's basically the idea of financial integrity, right? You've had anti-money laundering laws for a long time. After 9/11, there was a very clear concerted effort by U.S. Treasury and then the rest of the global community to make sure that it was difficult for anyone, basically to ensure that those things which are causing human suffering are not facilitated easily through the banking system. That's what financial integrity is about. That's what all these laws for compliance are really about at the end of the day. How can we make sure that our financial system is clean? And what we've seen is that in many situations, these standards of compliance aren't upheld, or they're dismissed. Maybe there's a sense that that these institutions are out of the view of OFAC or the financial community. One other thing about money laundering, right? Because that also is a term we sort of throw around, and it can be abstract, but just to bring it home, right? Money laundering serves a purpose. Think of the perspective from Hezbollah. What problem does money laundering solve? Money laundering solves a problem that if you're involved in illicit activity, you're making millions of dollars, right? If it's ill-wrought money, you have to have a way to get that money into your pockets or to someone else to move that money. So you need a way to mix it with legitimate activity. You need institutions. You can't just, even if you have a bank, you can't have a bank account that says cocaine profits or a bribery account, right? You can't have that. So what do illicit actors do? What has Hezbollah done? You find ways so that you can have a legitimate business, right? Have a legitimate business that does do something, whether it's a retail, and because you are pulling the levers on that business, or you have someone that is associated with you that runs that legitimate business, you can mix those profits with your profits, whether they're bribery profits, whether they're drug trade profits, right? You're able to mix so that it's easier for you to move money around to other parts of the world. And we've seen Hezbollah has done this. I won't go into detail because I don't want to take up time, and I want us to get to the discussion, obviously. But Hezbollah, has had a very well-known operation that involved mixing drug money with car profits that were used cars that were sold in mostly West Africa, Benin in particular. Right? This was an operation that allowed Hezbollah to team up with cartels to help cartels, because they have a need to launder money, to get drugs to Africa, and from Africa to Europe, and then to sort of mix the money, and the money would have to come back to pay off the in this case, Colombian drug suppliers. So in that process, there was a huge bank, the Lebanese Canadian Bank, which was a Lebanese bank, was involved. There was complicity, right? The bank officials knew that there were accounts at that bank that were being used by Hezbollah. So there are a lot of ways to combat this, and I'm sure we'll discuss it in discussion. But what I'll say is that the key force when you talk about sanctions, or one of the key tools that has been very successful going after Hezbollah and other entities, has been specifically putting designations on financial institutions. There's a part of the Patriot Act, Section 311 of the Patriot Act, which was used for that bank that I mentioned, Lebanese Canadian Bank. So this Section 311 is basically where U.S. Treasury says this financial institution is an institution of a primary money laundering concern. So it may be terrorist financing, it could be human trafficking, whatever it is, right? But by doing that, by putting a Section 311 designation on that financial institution, it makes it very difficult for that institution to really do business with the global financial system. Because now it's not just about, oh, this person is designated and you're doing business with that person. It's, oh, I'm whatever global bank. Is my correspondent bank designated? Is it itself designated as a money laundering concern? I can't do business with that bank, and that will have an echo effect. Lastly, I think the thing I'll say, just going into the Lebanon example with Hezbollah, the U.S. About 2 years ago put forth a Hezbollah financing, anti-Hezbollah financing act, and one of the key institutions that was impacted was the Central Bank of Lebanon. And what did the Central Bank do? From our conversations with former Treasury officials, Central Bank of Lebanon became very active because of the threat of the Lebanese banking system to be destroyed. So the central bank sort of had to get in there and get with the compliance. It had to try to ensure that if there were Hezbollah accounts in Lebanon, that they were closed. And actually they got a lot of blowback. But it was that strong, concerted, targeted move to go after the Lebanese banking system that made the central bank more aware of this. Maybe not, I shouldn't say more aware, but made it act. And so those are some of the things that we could discuss.
Thank you very much, Yaya. Before we get into a broader discussion, I just want to follow up very quickly with you, because I know very often, having worked on Africa for many years, whenever you associate those words, Africa, and then you talk about Islamist terrorist groups. You get people in the audience, the eyes roll over, you're an alarmist. You've begun to mention some things. You mentioned the car, automotive operation, Benin, et cetera. How do you respond to the idea, that pushback that, oh, this is Africa, it's different, our concerns, whether it be with Hezbollah, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, whatever, really don't belong here?
Yeah, I would say that's, to have that view is a bit short-sighted in terms of what's happening on the ground. Unfortunately, you have to think about a lot of these terrorist groups. Just to talk about, Daesh or ISIS. We're not talking about just one particular group. We're talking about, unfortunately, sort of a movement, right? The global terrorist movement that's an Islamist, the jihadist movement, the global jihadist movement. It's not in one particular place. And in fact, unfortunately, we've been doing some research looking at Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, right? All of them, obviously, they don't, where they are, the banking system is not as, they use cash more than they do the banking system. But the thing is, this is actually a growing phenomenon where groups, and we see it, wherever you have a state which perhaps is weak or that collapse or spaces that aren't, are governed more informally, you have the ability for these groups, we're seeing it, this is not hypothetical, these groups are taking control of smuggling routes, they're earning money, they're taxing people when they're transiting through their area. This is something that is real, it exists, and actually I would say we have an opportunity to focus on stemming it because there hasn't been as much attention or not the same sort of focused attention in Africa. But unfortunately, Islamist terrorism is very present throughout the continent, and we should be looking at areas where even if, let's say, ISIS doesn't have the biggest presence in Central Africa, right? The way terrorist financiers work is they look for weaknesses. They look for weak financial systems. So if they can't use UAE, I'm just throwing random, they can't use this banking system or that banking system, they will go wherever they have a connection so that they can move money. And that's probably the biggest fear that I have in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you. Let me begin by the discussion by posing a question to all three of you. And picking up from a point that Holly made earlier about the connection, this is the philosophical question. We'll begin with a little bit of philosophy. Philosophical question, or the chicken and egg problem. Holly mentioned earlier some of the things that we are concerned about, the violence, the increasing violence in Kasai, where the fact that one could say in the Congo last year, 1.4 million people have been displaced internally. More than 20,000 have become refugees in Angola alone and other places. Is this malfeasance that you've documented in this case study, is this a symptom of the overall breakdown in governance? Is it a symptom, or is it, turn it on its head, or is this a cause, if you will, or a motivation for the breakdown? Chicken and egg question. Any of the three of you want to tackle it?
I might change that characterization a little bit. I think that this is a symptom and a demonstration of not a breakdown, but of the manipulation of the system. That this is a microcosm of how networks that are engaged in large-scale theft move their money and launder their money in the ways that Yaya just explained. This is a small example of a wider pattern, one that we don't know very much about, and that's sort of where FIUs and the U.S. equivalent FinCEN, we need these institutions to use their resources to go in and investigate and find out what are the patterns. Is this connected to, is this particular case that we uncovered connected to wider patterns that are ongoing today? What other banks are involved? What other individuals are involved? but it's certainly a very clear, concrete example of the criminal and the practices that violate sanctions that need more attention in this particular part of the world, whether you're concerned about corruption in Congo or terror financing elsewhere. It's also significant, I want to point out, that more and more we're seeing evidence coming forward in the form of leaks, and that whistleblowers are sort of coming out of the woodwork now more than ever in a lot of ways, and that's an opportunity for organizations like ours, but also institutions of all stripes, to realize that these kinds of cases are important to the people of the countries where money is being stolen and laundered, that even despite serious threats, that folks are coming forward from inside the institutions and also doing investigations to uncover some of the hard evidence that is really needed. The one other thing I'll say is that in this one example, I think we see, and this is important for our work at the Sentry, that we don't, the institutions that can intervene and deploy anti-money laundering measures and even sanctions don't need evidence of billions of dollars leaving the country. They are interested in hard evidence that they can see and touch and talk to investigators about, and that sort of represents a wider problem.
I would say that this is, it's both a symptom and the sort of illicit financial activity and that we've seen in this report, and the movement of money through complicit banks is certainly a symptom of violent kleptocracy, as we call it at the Enough Project in the Sentry. But it's also a key enabler of that system. To sort of pivot to some of the other countries we're doing work on, in virtually every investigation that we have either released or begun or that's ongoing, we see a few different things every time. One is a rent-seeking opportunity that's taken by a high-level government official, an opportunity to steal, embezzle, move money in some way that's against the law. We've seen institutional failure in that country, so a failure of that government, whether it's Congo or South Sudan or Sudan or Central African Republic, to stop that flow of money. And we've seen people in those relevant institutions raise red flags. It's not always a capacity problem. This is often a political will problem. And then ultimately we see that money going through a financial institution, often in US dollars. I mean, it's a pattern that we see every single time. If there is a Lebanese terrorist financier with a corporate network in West and Central Africa conducting US dollar denominated transactions, I would say those transactions are pretty popular. And any US dollar denominated transaction for a split second clears through a correspondent bank in the US 99% of the time. That gives us immense power. So this is, whether it's a symptom or an ultimate driver, I think is an important conceptual question. But ultimately, I think it's both. And I think that the fact that there's such frequent use of the U.S. financial system means that we have the tools to tackle both the symptom and the cause here.
Yeah, I would just tack on. I think I agree with what everyone has said. The big issue, there's a symptom here. It's a symptom of the overall lack of transparency. People acting with impunity. And I think, we can, again, it is very philosophical, but I think at the end of the day, we have to think about, people make decisions. So whether it's a bank official, whether it's a government official, people make the decision whether or not they are going to, if they know someone is designated, if it's Hezbollah, they know if either they're going to sort of uphold the standards that have been put out there for financial institutions and distance themselves or separate or cooperate, comply, or they're going to ignore, maybe because of their interest with the designated individual and that network. So people make choices at high levels, but when there's not transparency, they often are more emboldened to act in this way.
Thank you. Now, from the philosophical and theoretical, perhaps to the concrete, this report makes some very concrete recommendations, and I think it's what's very interesting to me is that it embraces, if you will, smart sanctions as a tool, as opposed to the blunt instruments that we've used in the past, and that's pretty much in concord with the last national security strategy document in the United States, which emphasized smart sanctions over blunt, broad sanctions. For those who perhaps aren't as familiar with some of the things you've thrown out in here, Executive Order 13224, the Section 314 of the Patriot Act, FinCEN, Holly or Jay, would you like to walk us through, at least in broad strokes, the specific recommendations to deal with this case study and perhaps more broadly, the Congolese case that you recommend in your report?
Yeah, so maybe I'll discuss some of the tools in general, and then Holly can tailor that discussion to the Congo case. So we've dedicated a lot of time, energy, and effort at the Enough Project and the Century to identifying and mapping the tools of financial pressure at the U.S. government's disposal and at the disposal of other organizations around the world, as John mentioned in the opening. Really, we're talking about 3 buckets of tools that we think can be used in this context and in East and Central Africa in general. The first are sanctions, as you mentioned, and the way the U.S. government has deployed sanctions in Africa over the past decade or so essentially guarantees failure. It's throwing a couple names on press releases by OFAC and then not really having too much enforcement, not really following up, not thinking about them in a context of really creating leverage and pressure. And there have been times when they've been accompanied with a diplomatic strategy, and I think that's when they're most effective. Or the flip side of the coin is that there have been blunt sanctions that are complete embargoes or that maybe jeopardize activity in an entire economic sector that hurts civilian populations that have nothing to do with the conflict or corruption that we're talking about, much more than the actual targets. So there is a middle ground, and John mentioned it. It's something that we're talking about is network sanctions. And I think the smartest sanctions in any context are the ones that really apply the most appropriate pressure on the target regime. If you just designate a senior top-level official and he immediately has an assistant or an aide or a front company, they're just going to begin using those companies instead of using their own names and bank accounts. But when it's a priority for the U.S. government, as is the case in the Tajideen case that we profiled, there's often robust follow-up action. There's significant effort to not only just name a few people, but to find out which companies they own, which sectors are they involved in, who are they doing business with, what are the addresses of their companies. And with the Tajideen case, we saw not just Qasem being designated, but 2 of his brothers, and then 6 or 7 companies under his control. And then banks actually followed through quite a bit. The norm is that banks comply. So banks have a robust capacity to understand who these entities are, who they're doing business with. So that's the first bucket, is the network sanctions. And we think that's the most appropriate tool in this context. The second are these anti-money laundering tools that Yaya mentioned, and I won't go into too much depth. But what I would say is I think we're at the 1.0 understanding of these tools. The Section 311 of the Patriot Act that Yaya mentioned has really only been used around 15 times, I think. And there are 5 special measures associated with that particular tool, ranging from cutting off correspondent banking for the financial institution or the company or individual or entity. There are 4 other special measures that just haven't been used yet, and they range from requiring banks to keep more records to requiring them to conduct more due diligence to requiring enhanced record keeping. We think there's a lot of space there to use that tool a little bit more like a scalpel than an axe. And the third area is targeted prosecutions for people that are not only behind these financial crimes and violence, but for the institutions and entities that enable and facilitate them wittingly. Maybe Holly can talk a little bit more about the Congo context for these recommendations?
Yeah, sure. So going back a little bit, in January of 2015, just to sort of flesh out an example that I think shows how targeted sanctions has worked in the Congo context. Back in January 2015, civil society saw the writing on the wall related to the Kabila regime and worried that there would not be a democratic election as was mandated by the Constitution by the end of Kabila's constitutional term, which was ended December 2016, and began demonstrating, began organizing, protesting, and those demonstrations were met with excessive use of force and repression by security forces. That continued throughout the year, and eventually, with enough sort of outcry and pressure from both within and outside of Congo, the U.S. government and even the European Union essentially began to deploy targeted sanctions against some of the top-level leaders who were responsible for this strategy of repression against civil society. The US and EU sanctioned over a dozen individuals over the course of several months, deploying those designations in tranches, basically ratcheting up the pressure against the sort of military arm of the strategy, the intelligence arm of the strategy, and the police, knowing that these individuals and their troops were involved in brutal repression against protesters. That kind of coordinated effort against very specific individuals had measurable impact. We know that from eyewitness accounts and activists who follow the situation very closely that each time there were new designations, the security forces would relent in a certain way, and that an explosion of mass violence that was predicted ahead of certain dates. Certainly, there was a lot of loss of life, still repressive tactics by security forces, but not quite at the level that a lot of folks feared. And importantly, those sanctions were part of a constellation of events that led to a brokered agreement by the National Conference of Catholic Bishops between the government and the opposition and other groups that set in place legitimate benchmarks for sort of a roadmap to get to elections and a democratic transition. What we haven't seen is sanctions that are targeted in this way and coordinated in this way against the financial networks underlying the Kabila government and those folks who have interest in the regime staying in place. And just to talk through some of the important opportunities that the US has, they can deploy these targeted sanctions under 3 different authorities. One is an executive order relating to individuals undermining peace and democracy. One is related to counter-terror financing. And now we know that there are actors involved in those kinds of transactions and activities in Congo. And then third is the Global Magnitsky Act, which gives the US authority to place sanctions on individuals or entities responsible for significant acts of corruption. So there's sort of a menu of options here, and it's time for coordination, and the involvement of European countries is critical. This has to be sort of a broad effort that's coordinated between actors to really levy the amount of pressure that's needed at this point to change the calculus. I want to talk just a bit more about the point on prosecutions. That's something we've talked about anti-money laundering and the importance of deeper investigations by financial intelligence units and banking due diligence, but it's really critical to point out the role of traditional justice authorities and law enforcement in this case Yaya mentioned earlier that that money laundering and terror financing and corruption occurs in all different places. It's not concentrated in one place, and that actually gives a lot of opportunity to justice authorities, because some of this money is moving through banks or companies that that are in Europe, that are all over the world, where justice authorities have jurisdiction to intervene. And the other point, just dovetailing with something Yaya was talking about, is that when money is being laundered, there's a laundry list of crimes that are going on. There's embezzlement, there's extortion, there's conspiracy attached to money laundering, and that, again, just gives law enforcement the opportunity to intervene, and we need to see more of it, especially with regard to money leaving this part of the world.
I'll just, one small thing, just maybe as a framing, because people think about sanctions and they'll say, oh, sanctions don't work, or we have enough sanctions. People should understand that, particularly in the US and globally, the role of sanctions tools has evolved. And like was mentioned right before, originally, I mean, Hezbollah is a good example. Hezbollah has actually been designated for 20 years, or a little over 20 years. In the early days, in the 80s and 90s, sanctioning was very broad, very blunt. And look at cases like, look at Hezbollah, look at the U.S. going after Iran and the Iran nuclear issue. That sort of progressed the tools to become more targeted. And I think that we've probably seen more success with the sort of targeted and more sort of network approached sanctions. So the role of sanctions are evolving and should continue.
Okay, thank you. Now, as we open it up for questions, reminder, if you raise your hand if you have a question. And then two things. One is please wait for the microphone. For the sake of everyone else, as well as those who are watching us on live stream, please kindly identify yourself by name and institution. And in the interest of trying to get to as many people as possible, please limit yourself to a question and not a speech. There's plenty of rental halls around the city if you'd like to make a speech, and you can invite people to hear you then. So, something like that.
Yeah, actually, I was going to let the governor speak first, and then I can ask one question.
Okay. If the governor has a question, go ahead. Please stand up, if you would stand up. And okay. Okay. S'il vous plaît.
Oui, bonjour à tous. Excusez-moi, je vais parler en français. Il y a quelqu'un qui va traduire, mon collègue ici à ma droite. Je m'appelle Mutombo, je suis gouverneur de la Banque centrale du Congo, de passage ici aux assemblées du Fonds monétaire et de la Banque mondiale. Et j'ai appris cette nouvelle et j'ai demandé de participer à cette réunion. Et oui, en RDC, les autorités sont conscientes du méfait du blanchiment des capitaux et du financement du terrorisme, notamment sur la paix et la sécurité internationale. Et c'est pourquoi, depuis longtemps, depuis 2004-2003, le pays s'est résolument engagé dans la lutte contre ce fléau, le financement du terrorisme, le blanchiment des capitaux, et c'est conformément au principe du groupe d'action financière, le GAFI. Je vais revenir sur les dispositifs légaux et opérationnels contre le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement du terrorisme au pays, mais concernant plus particulièrement les allégations portées sur la BGF Bank, qui aurait facilité les transferts en faveur du Hezbollah. Et la Banque centrale du Congo ne peut pas accepter ce genre d'opération parce qu'elle est l'autorité de régulation et de contrôle. J'ai demandé à ce qu'on prépare une mission d'enquête. Un rapport sera fait.
S'il vous plaît, monsieur, donnez un instant pour l'introduction.
So the authorities have been working on these problems since 2004, and he was about to continue on with the various ways in which they're tackling these issues in Congo?
Mais selon les informations que j'ai reçues de la BGFI, cette dernière rejette ces accusations. Elle déclare que, à l'ouverture de compte de ces sociétés, toutes les procédures de vérification d'usage à l'entrée en relation d'un client en relation d'affaires avec la banque, avec la BGFI, avaient été effectuées pour bien connaître le client.
Okay. He said that from the information he's received from the BGFI bank, all the at the time these accounts were open, all the necessary background investigations were conducted on due diligence.
Et cette procédure de vérification est bien évidemment caractérisée par les exigences de conformité internationale, dont les outils décisifs que toutes les banques utilisent chez nous sont notamment la liste actualisée au FAC sur des personnes sanctionnées, des personnes inscrites sur la liste noire. Il y a la base de données de l'Interpol, également sur les personnes frappées des sanctions, nationales comme internationales. Il y a la base de données partagée de l'Union européenne sur les mêmes personnes sanctionnées des Nations Unies.
Okay. He said at the time the due diligence was done, the OFAC blacklist was consulted as well as the European Union lists.
Également, la base de données de la centrale des risques de la Banque centrale, la base de données de la cellule nationale de renseignement financier en RDC qui s'appelle la CENAREF, et également les outils de contrôle exigés par les correspondants bancaires européens et américains.
They checked the central banks list as well as the financial intelligence unit of the Democratic Republic of Congo's list, as well as those of corresponding banks.
Et donc, ces vérifications n'ont pas eu à démontrer de lien ni direct ni indirect de ces trois sociétés avec Congo Futur.
He said that they have not demonstrated the link between banks and Congo Future, the three companies involved.
Et aucun des correspondants n'avait eu à bloquer les transactions initiées par ces trois sociétés, mais il y a eu du temps mis pour répondre aux demandes de ces correspondants sur les justificatifs liés à ces opérations.
The blockage was not on the transaction sums, but they have responded to the requests for justifying the transactions.
Mais cependant, le FAC a eu à bloquer le fonds lié à une transaction initiée par un des clients qui s'appelle Kin Trading. Et à la suite de ce blocage, la BGFI avait décidé de mettre un terme à la relation avec ce client.
That one bank, and I'm sorry, I did not understand the name of the company, but when it was blocked by OFAC, the bank put an end to that relationship.
Et la BGFI a adressé une demande à OFAC pour connaître la raison de ce blocage, mais c'est une demande qui est restée sans réponse jusqu'à aujourd'hui.
And the bank asked OFAC for the reason for blocking the transaction, and OFAC has not responded.
Et pour les autres clients,
for the other clients,
à part Kin Trading, dont les relations ont été rompues, jusqu'à ce jour, des vérifications menées n'indiquent pas de lien ni direct ni indirect de ces sociétés avec le Congo Futur.
Within the investigations of the other companies, they have not found any direct or indirect links with Congo Futures.
Dans tous les cas, moi j'attendrai le rapport des enquêtes que nous venons de diligenter à Kinshasa.
And he's now awaiting the results of the investigation which they have launched in Kinshasa. Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Non, je n'ai pas fini. Je n'ai pas fini.
Oui, mais si vous avez une...
oui, je vais aller rapidement.
Je vais terminer, s'il vous plaît.
Oui. Donc, à la Banque centrale, nous veillons pour les banques à l'obligation de surveillance, vigilance pour identifier chaque client.
The central bank, we have the mission to supervise and maintain vigilance over every client.
Et tout transfert international est soumis au contrôle imposé par la réglementation du change et la réglementation en matière de lutte contre le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement du terrorisme.
Every international transfer is subject to regulations affecting those transfers.
Et les banques ont l'obligation également de surveillance prudentielle de toute opération de manière à signaler à la cellule nationale de renseignement financier par déclaration de soupçon pour toute opération jugée inhabituelle dont l'origine des fonds n'est pas justifiée.
And every bank has the obligation to be on the watch for suspicious transactions and to report to the National Financial Intelligence Unit any transaction where the origin of the money is suspect.
Oui. L'obligation également d'un compliance officer dans les dispositifs de contrôle interne, c'est important.
Every institution must have an internal compliance officer with these responsibilities.
Mais sur le plan national, le pays est en relation avec beaucoup d'organisations régionales et internationales qui sont dans la lutte contre le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement du terrorisme.
On a national level, we have relations with regional and international organizations who fight to combat illicit finance.
Nous sommes membres du groupe d'action contre le blanchiment d'argent en Afrique centrale qui s'appelle le GABAC et qui est en relation avec le groupe d'action financière, le GAFI.
We are members of the regional group for combating money laundering.
Membre effectif. Et du 27 novembre au 1er décembre, nous avons un séminaire à Kinshasa de pré-évaluation de notre dispositif anti-blanchiment et anti-financement du terrorisme par ce GABAC avec GAFI.
And we're an effective member between 25th of November, 1st of December. We're going to have a seminar in Kinshasa to evaluate our participation in all this.
Le système bancaire congolais souffre déjà.
S'il vous plaît.
Oui,
très vite.
Les
autres
oui.
ont le droit de parler aussi,
oui,
monsieur.
Oui.
Un minute, s'il vous plaît.
D'accord. Nous sommes venus avec les banques au mois de juin, en réunion avec le département du Trésor, pour parler de notre évolution pendant ces 10 dernières années en matière de connaissance des clients, en matière de lutte contre le blanchiment des capitaux et le financement du terrorisme. Toutes les banques étaient venues ici et nous avons échangé et nous avons l'obligation de geler les avoirs de toute personne qui est sanctionnée par les États-Unis, par les Nations Unies, par toute organisation internationale.
And in June, we had a bilateral meeting with the Department of the Treasury to evaluate our progress in recent years and recognizing our obligations.
Et pour finir, notre système bancaire ne laisse pas de complaisance par la possibilité au financement du terrorisme et à la lutte, disons, au blanchiment des capitaux. C'est un système qui est normatif et qui est très contraignant. Je vous remercie.
And we are working on a coordinated system to prevent any sort of terrorism finance, and we're working very committed to that. Any from the panel, any responses to that?
You know, it's not every day we have a central bank governor as an audience for our report, so I really appreciate you attending. And it's also not every day we hear a response of a private bank from a central bank governor. So thank you for your very in-depth responses to the allegations. You know, I should mention a couple things. One, we endeavor to solicit comment and ask questions to everyone named in any of our reports, including BGFI. And I would direct anyone to page 6 of the report to see BGFI's response, which was not quite as detailed as what we just heard. But a few things jumped out at me that I think I can respond to. One is that BGFI Bank undertook due diligence about these clients. That's true, they did. And they found that they were connected to Congo Future. There were numerous warnings in writing from the bank. And we stand by our evidence, we stand by our reporting. Those are facts. In terms of the links between Congo Future, Ovelast Trading, and the companies we mentioned, those are links that you can read about in other public reports. I would encourage you to read the report to examine the specific linkages. I don't want to rattle off a bunch of connections for this audience. But the types of things that we see are subsidiary relationships, transactions between these entities with one another with great frequency, and then shared physical location with the headquarters of Congo Future. That's pretty low-hanging fruit for due diligence research at a bank. So I would suggest that that the comment about Kin Trading also needs a little bit more elaboration. So Kin Trading is a company that BGFI Bank identified as a subsidiary of Congo Future in early 2011, just a few months after Congo Future was designated under sanctions. There were several written warnings that mentioned Kin Trading by name, and then correspondent banks began blocking transactions related to this company, saying they can't process them because of counterterrorism financing concerns. So these transactions we do think stopped in late 2011 or early 2012. However, in March 2016, another company that's reported subsidiary of Congo Future emails BGFI Bank. It's called Modern Construction, also known as SCCM, requesting to engage in some sort of currency exchange service. And the email domain name is, it's yusuf@kintrading.com. And that company also shares a physical address with Congo Future. So, this isn't incredibly complex rocket science we're talking about here. And I would just say that we stand by the report. We think that this merits a whole heck of a lot more scrutiny from regulators and law enforcement. And we would hope that the Congolese government takes this very, very seriously because of the risk it poses to the country's financial system as a whole.
I'd like to go.
That's great.
Question over here, this gentleman. Sorry.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Chris DeHappy. I'm an American citizen, and I've operated in DRC since 2006. I want to thank you, Yaya, for your great work. I've read extensively on your work, and I commend you. I happen to be African American, but Jewish, member of AIPAC. So anything related to Hezbollah is of a big concern to me. I'm here on a business trip, and of course, I've got an email from someone about Hezbollah. Then I came. So what I want to tell, first I have 3 questions and a comment, Doctor. Is there hope for DRC? My answer is yes. I live continuously in DRC since 2006. Started a company, and we're operating. I initiated the American Chamber of Commerce, which I preside. I'm not here as a president of AmCham. I'm here as myself, and a mini cheerleader of Congo. I've seen progress, although there are lots more to do. Unfortunately, the governor have not really spoken about the technical tools that have engaged to sort of bring in the company offline to an online transaction system. In 2010, I believe, there was a company called Montran from New York City. They implemented a system to communicate between the central bank and all the banks.
Move on to get people
quickly. Yes.
Very quickly.
So Congo is working already on a system to get transaction online. Congo is already working on a system. My company is having a hard time transferring $10,000 out of DRC. You have to prove lots of paperwork. It wasn't so in 2006. I just want to make sure that as an American citizen, we don't spend so much time talking in a country, a post-nation conflict, torn apart. I have no Congolese ancestry. I do my business, but I think the Congolese people need to be held like, in quotation, like children, and get them out of the process of the post-war culture. So what I suggest from what I'm hearing here is that the main man here today is Yaya. Yaya should come to DRC. Someone, Mr. Governor, you should invite Yaya to DRC Explain to him exactly, because he's in the counterterrorism, he's in money laundering and all the finance and terrorism. Yeah, should come to DRC and visit and actually validate the American way, what they're doing on the ground. My question to the Century Project people, how come you're doing such a very strategic report without talking to us, Americans living in DRC? Have you spoken to the LDS, to the Jehovah's Witnesses, to all the American people that live continuously, day to day, with the Congolese people? That's essentially my question. I'm not casting a doubt to your report, but I'm just sort of
thank you.
enlarging what
Give them a
you
chance
should
to
cover.
quickly answer that.
Just really quickly, as a matter of policy and practice, we don't discuss sources, but if you have information that you think is worthy of consideration for one of our future investigations, we'd love to talk to you.
Okay. Question in the back to
Hi, I'm Didier Jacobs with Oxfam and the Fact Coalition. In some countries, including the United States, it's very easy to create anonymous companies to hide one's identity. In your experience, how big of a problem are anonymous companies?
In Congo?
Sure. You know, I think they're a really big problem. They make due diligence a lot harder. They make it's the easiest way to obfuscate your identity when engaging in a business transaction. In the report, you'll see a reference to the Panama Papers. Oblast Trading, one of the companies linked to Qasem Tajuddin, was actually a client of Mossack Fonseca, I believe, and its shareholders are available in the Panama Papers database, but you won't even see all the names because a large portion of the shares have been held in bearer share accounts, which is essentially whoever holds the piece of paper saying you have shares in the company is the actual shareholder. It's among the greatest ways of hiding your identity, possibly. But even then, BGFI Bank identified who was behind the companies and continued to process the transactions anyway. So yes, they're a massive problem, but they're not an excuse. And there are ways of conducting due diligence and finding out who's behind these companies that do involve a certain level of rigorous research that I think banks need to engage in.
One footnote to that, in the Congo context, yes, one of the conglomerates, Oblast, is offshored, and that's an issue. But one of the things about Congo and business networks is that a lot of these companies are the names and the connections are fairly transparent, and nothing is being done. The Congo Research Group, Bloomberg, Global Witness have all done very good mapping of many of the networks, showing that over 80 companies in Congo or connected to Congo are linked to Kabila and his family members and some of his closest cronies. Some of this stuff is hiding in plain sight, and we need regulators and AML authorities to take interest in that information that's coming out and heed, our sort of concrete recommendations for action, which is more investigation under certain sections of the Patriot Act and targeted sanctions against these companies that are now very clearly connected to the regime and some of the underlying financial networks that are allowing both money laundering and potential terror financing, and sort of the digging in related to the political crisis.
Yeah. And I'll just say, actually, one of the parts of the report that really sort of sprung out at me is page 31, the very last paragraph. One of the recommendations is creating a public corporate registry. As someone who does, research and investigations on, trying to uncover front companies, that's a big thing. So for there to be a public, searchable online registry of Congolese companies and who owns them would be great. Okay.
Great. We're drawing to the end of our time, and in order to get the most people in, I'm going to take 3 questions in a row, and then whoever in the panel wants to. First in the back there, and then the lady, and then the gentleman here. and I apologize to others, but we're at the end of the time, and out of respect for when we told people this event would end. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Very briefly, identify
Yes,
yourself.
I'm Lasco Nawezi. I'll be quick. I have a question for Yaya. It seems that the gentleman said that there is a lot of mechanisms and tools to kind of control the flow of money in the Congo. But do you think that maybe the actors, because you talk about the actors and those are people, should we question their integrity, that they are not doing what they are supposed to do? Because the system is in place.
Okay. One question. The lady here.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I'm Queen Ramkissoon, Vice President of International Business Development for Alpha Energy, Renewable Energy. And my question is, what is the Atlantic Council's stand on the relationship of companies that are using illegal child labor, illegally mining of cobalt and coltan, the manufacture of the products, and getting them out of the country, the transferring of funds and money laundering, and how does that relate to sanctions? Thank you.
And then,
My name is Zihindula Mulego. I think some of you guys know me. I'm an attorney for many of the people that have been designated for sanctions, including General Lenga. So, and all the people in Congo that have been designated for sanctions here in the United States. I'm also the president of the Center for Political and Strategic Studies, which is a think tank that tries to link the grassroots to decision makers. Just quickly, without going into much details, if I want to, I don't know the word in English, but in French it's confrère, my colleague is another lawyer. You're talking about the EU-US sanctions. And you said that these sanctions have had an impact. First of all, the sanctions, the way these are done. I give you an example of my client, Francois Olenga, General Lenga. The only thing they say about General Lenga is this: they say that General Lenga was giving orders to the Republican Guards. But if you look at the structure of the Republican Guard, General Lenga does not have anything to do with the Republican Guard. He has no power in the command structure of the Democratic Republic of Congo. He has absolutely no power to give any orders for somebody to go after the demonstration. So I think I think we need to review the way we are designating these people. Like in the case of Olenga, who has absolutely nothing to do with giving orders with the army. I don't want to go too much details because I don't want to abuse of my time. Now, quickly, I just wanted to say that the governor has asked me to say that maybe my very good friend John Prendergast and the Enough Project, if you have more information, if there is any possibility of cooperation with him, he's willing to sit down with you and cooperate with you. And lastly, I want to correct something in the report. I'm assuming that what you're talking about BGFI, because I'm also a lawyer for Francis Selemani. I'm also his lawyer. Now, I'm assuming that what you're talking about, the transaction you're talking about, is the transaction that is being investigated by DOJ for the moment, which it's a transaction which dates back to 2011. And if that's the case, Francis was not even the CEO of that company. So he's really being wrongfully accused. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. For turning to the panel for the final word, let me just very quickly answer the lady's question, if I can get her attention. The response on the Atlantic Council does not, as a matter of you read our mandate, we do not take official positions on any matter. Our individual scholars have varying positions which they take, and it's a matter of our policy of intellectual independence. So it's each individual analyst and scholar, and they within that policy. So we don't have, if you will, an official position on anything. So that I turn to the panel. Yeah, I think the first question was addressed to you, Yaya.
Yes.
Thank you for the question. It's a critical area of interest of the Enough Project in particular. As many of you know, we've worked on the issue of conflict minerals, primarily in Eastern Congo, in the Kivus, tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. But cobalt is really a sort of an important new frontier of interest for due diligence and responsible mining practices, and certainly combating the child mining that's going on. Congo is the site of 60% of the world's cobalt supply, and with the rise of electric cars in particular, this is something that needs serious scrutiny. So watch for some work coming out from us on that, and thanks again for your attention to the issue.
Thank you very much.
On the question on people's, do we question people's integrity? I would say it's important to not make any of this personal. No one here can see into the hearts, the hearts of people or their minds in terms of motivation. The important thing is to think about a system of financial integrity. And that's what I was trying to say in the beginning, that there has to be, the financial system has to have integrity because people are weak. Unfortunately, even if they have good intentions and they're nice people, you need a system of financial integrity to keep things in check.
And then either Holly or JR want to respond to Mr. Malegwa? Or?
Yeah, so really quickly on, on the Soleimani point, we stand by our reporting. We have documentary evidence. And if you'd like to dispute it or talk to us or provide any sort of response, we did and will give him further opportunities, and we hope to hear more answers to some of the questions. In terms of willingness to cooperate, that sounds wonderful. One question I do have, last year the New York Times reported that $95.7 million had been transferred from Jacquemines in sort of irregular transactions or tax advances to the central bank, and that money had gone through Rabobank and BGFI, and $8 million of those dollars were reportedly withdrawn in cash from BGFI. I'm wondering where that money went, so that could be one of the first things we discuss.
Also, on the points about Olenga, first, thank you for your service. None of this scrutiny, none of these processes would mean anything without representative counsel for the other side, right? It's important that that the due diligence by sanctions authorities is thorough, and that's where justice authorities can come in as well, that the Justice Department is doing thorough investigations, independent investigations. Unfortunately, we know from eyewitness testimony, from insider testimony, that Olenga, whether in formal title or otherwise, that OFAC found the connections very clear, and that European authorities found those connections clear, that orders were coming down, and that this was a coordinated effort on the part of very high-level security forces, not only by military generals with those titles, but by intelligence officials, police authorities, and that is often how this kind of repression works. High-level advisors from a range of different offices can often be involved. That's what the sanctions authorities found after thorough investigations, after ample evidence coming in the form of packages, and those sanctions came down, and civil society was naming these individuals. They were asking for more pressure, more sanctions, and they still are against the financial networks of the regime as well. So,
thank you. Before closing on thanking our panel, I want to just make one final note that we're obviously all four of us here, and John, others are very seized with the question emanating from the Congo. For those who are wondering why this focus, there's an excellent article in Foreign Affairs last Friday by John Prendergast and Sasha Lezhnev on why this is so important, not just for Congo and friends of Congo, but really for the United States and the international community as a whole, and I highly commend that article. And I'd like to thank the ambassador again for honoring us with his presence, and Monsieur le Gouverneur, je vous remercie de votre présence et aussi vos paroles ici et votre disponibilité d'être en dialogue avec nos amis. And thank you to all of you, and please join me in thanking Yaya, Holly, and JR.